Constanze Fischbeck, active director at the HFG, and we are finally really happy to be opening the Shifting Paradigms Conference, which has been in our brains for quite some time now. In a moment we're going to have keep this as congenial and discursive as possible, hence the reason we're doing this discussion here in this space and not in an auditorium with a stage. That we really want everybody to kind of talk with one another and with each other over the next 2 days. I have some specific thank yous to say, or specific welcomes to say. One is to Sabine Feist from MBK, who is the deputy head of the unit of Kunst and Music Hochschule. Welcome. And to Dominika Schoper from the city of Karlsruhe, from Antonia Martin, and Regina Fasshauser, co-Leitung of the Kunst Bureau, to Matthias Overbeck, professor at HFM Karlsruhe, but also to many, many other colleagues from other universities who have come here to take part in our thinking about how we might develop research, artistic research, between our universities and our cultural institutions and our wider publics, I think, as well. So with that, I will hand over to Constanze.
Thank you, Alistair. First of all, people who are standing, there is a few seats in front, because it takes a while. Maybe it's better to sit. Yes, I will tell a little bit the story of this venture. First of all, also from my side, a warm welcome to everybody, to my colleagues, to all the guests of the symposium, and I'm Constanze Fischbeck. As Alistair said, I also work as a professor for scenography at the HFG Karlsruhe, and same time as deputy rector, and of the Karlsruhe University of Arts and Design, and as we call it in short and in German, the HFG Karlsruhe. Our art school with university right was founded in 1992 as a partner institution of the ZKM. Heinrich Klotz, the founding director, had the vision of two mutually dependent institutions. Teaching, studying, researching, exhibiting, these areas, so his idea were to take place simultaneously at different levels in both institutions, complementing each other. So, as also Alistair said before, symbolically the symposium is taking place in both institutions. We have the first panel here, and then later on we move over there to the HFG, to the place where the registration was taking place. I'm pleased to be able to open this symposium and would like to briefly explain the background and the aims of this venture. For us, the symposium is a kind of prologue to the postgraduate programs that we want to establish as an umbrella structure for existing and future research projects with the ZKM, but also in cooperation with other institutions. This idea in very different forms has been with HFG and ZKM for many years and in different formats. The motivation has always been to create a space for a special kind of interdisciplinary research using the resources and preconditions of both institutions. And we have looked in the archive, and we actually found 5 different attempts in between 1999 and 2018, and I will briefly tell about them. Now comes the history. The Daniel Liebeskind Research Studio was still conceived by Heinrich Klotz and existed at the HFG from 1999 to 2003. Students from all Fachgruppen devoted themselves to the exploration of space from a wide range of perspectives. Legend has it that this is where the productive combination of exhibition design and scenography as two interrelated courses of study originated. This is a fact. I didn't knew before because I started much after this time here. In 2000, Hans Belting, 2 years before his retirement, had initiated the still very famous DFG-Projekt and Forschungskolleg Bildkörpermedium, eine anthropologische Perspektive, which developed image research as an interdisciplinary project until 2009, for 9 years, longest attempt. It was not only an attempt, it was a very successful project. From 1999 to 2004, there was a postgraduate certificate program in media art and film led by André Ujika and Boris Kreuz. In 2009, a HFG Research Institute was founded on the initiative of Peter Sloterdijk. It was intended to combine research projects from the theoretical fields of philosophy, design and media theory, as well as art, cultural and social science, in order to supplement the research activities of the Department of Art and Media Philosophy. Finally, in 2016 to 18, an English language postgraduate program at the HFG in collaboration with ZKM Karlsruhe was planned under the title PhD Research and Development in Art and Technology by the former rector Siegfried Zielinski. In this context, the first draft of the doctoral degree program was created. The problem was, the basis of a law was not there yet. That's why it didn't came through. So the postgraduate program was not realized, but however, an outcome of this attempt was an also famous research seminar created together with Bruno Latour. What can we learn from these various attempts? The common thread is that all wanted to give various research topics a place and a format, mostly combined with a degree. And these topics were often ones that were suitable for the joint expertise of HFG and ZKM. The special expertise of the HFG lies in the interdisciplinary teaching and research in theory and practice. We would like to contribute this also here, including all our departments. In the best case, the finding of the research methods will in turn influence teaching of study courses at the HFG. Our current new plan for the postgraduate programs should therefore be able to serve as more than just an infrastructure for one project, but rather as an umbrella structure for several different research projects also possible at both institutions. The possibility that the HFG, also in cooperation with other universities, would be granted the right to award doctorates for the hybrid PhD through the fifth, and I have to say that in German, Hochschulrechtsänderungsgesetz in Baden-Württemberg is now an additional chance. At the same time, this new attempt opens up the possibilities of being able to think anew and more openly about different types and ways of research and to develop a model of our own that, among other things, allows for and welcomes the productive influence of the research interests not only of different fields, but also of doctoral students, those who have already completed their doctorates and those who have not, together. This structural change can really make visible what is already there. It is rooted in the already existing research projects of the HFG and ZKM, for instance the Herzlab or the Abteilung Wissen, and could thus be given greater visibility overall. The venture should be more than a PhD machine, of course. We want first of all attract good research projects with innovative potential, including innovative research methods. As we know, artistic research has developed into a recognized field of knowledge production. And in design, too, the self-image of being an inherently research-based discipline is becoming increasingly pronounced. Over the last 2 years, my colleague Matthias Brun and I have been working with Alistair Hudson and other colleagues on a new draft for postgraduate programs at HFG in cooperation with ZKM and presented it to our partners at the Ministry for Science, MVK, at the beginning of this year. We believe that the transformation processes of FG and ZKM together with the decision to launch a pilot phase of a hybrid PhD in Baden-Württemberg create a momentum, a kind of fortunate moment in time. And we have been pleased about this for almost the whole year, as the state of Baden-Württemberg has announced this pilot phase as part of the new, again, Hochschulrechtsänderungsgesetz, which was passed by the Landtag just last week. I quote, and I say this in German, it's like untranslatable. Das Wissenschaftsministerium kann eine Kunsthochschule oder einen Zusammenschluss von Kunsthochschulen, dessen Zweck die Heranbildung des wissenschaftlich-künstlerischen Nachwuchses und die Weiterentwicklung der künstlerischen Forschung ist, nach qualitätsgeleiteten Kriterien befristet und thematisch begrenzt das wissenschaftlich-künstlerische Promotionsrecht verleihen. Soweit Ende Zitat. Consequently, we are not yet at the point where we can announce a new PhD program or say exactly what the structure will look like. That will remain the work of 2025, among other things. As a preliminary stage and for our own self-understanding, we have developed the Symposium, Shifting Paradigms. It developed from a conversation between about 8 art, design and theory professors from the HFG and Alistair Hudson. The title Shifting Paradigms stands here as a thesis to our questions about transformed processes of artistic scientific research. It was developed by Thomas Kuhn in the 1960s, which means that instead of a linear development in which each production of knowledge leads to an expansion and refinement, Kuhn claimed that science works within a certain paradigm until moments of discontinuity and crisis arise, which sometimes bring about sudden and abrupt changes without the possibility of reversal. We ask ourselves at which point of this shift we find ourselves, and to what extent the existing systems of research have contributed to the conditions that determine our present. Our aim for the coming symposium is to discuss possible transformations in the structures and the conditions of scientific and artistic scientific research. We want to analyze how paradigms in art and design are shifting in terms of research and production, as well as their dissemination and reception. Shifting, for instance, beyond the digital, or from the interdisciplinary to the post-disciplinary, or from the rather European, more territorial quality of disciplines, to a more open formulation. We are concerned with more than just expanding the discourse to include topics and terms that were previously excluded or ignored. A paradigm shift means a detachment that becomes necessary when valid paradigms lose their explanatory power, when deviations occur that can no longer be incorporated into the explanatory models of the existing paradigm. In this context, one can of course also question the concept of the paradigm itself, which might be a discussion point in this symposium. 4 panels with the heading Polycrisis, this is the one following this evening, Research Matters, and Kill the Dr. Phil, text-based practice and artistic research, and The Art of Research have been developed from the discussions among our colleagues. A symposium architecture together with a graphic design has been developed by a workshop of communication design, scenography and exhibition design students, and we invite you to inaugurate it later today as part of the dinner intervention. How can we describe our time? Simplified and not only related to the situation and role of research, one can also say, quite freely based on Antonio Gramsci. The great crises are piling up and the prevailing solutions are no longer working, without the new ones being able to take hold. We stare paralyzed at the monstrous forms of ecological destruction, war and exploitation. It is all the more important to emerge from the shock of the current political situation and to develop new resilience and the ability to act. Also in this sense, we are delighted to be able to start with this larger, more public discussion here, at this place and at this time. And there will still be time to express our very sincere thanks to everybody, but right now I just want to thank to one person especially, to Désirée Düdder-Lechner, who prepared this mainly for half a year, and without her very patient and very empathic work, we would sit here. Thank you very much. Thank you. I'm pleased that you're all here. Please feel warmly welcome once again. I'm now very happy to hand over to Alistair again, who will say a few words to the following panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Constanze. Yes, but I'll be brief so we can just get on with it, I think, which we're all ready to do. So, this panel is called Polycrisis, which is also a term I think we probably argue over and dispute over, but we shall enjoy doing that as part of the discussion in a moment with Zschocke, Sheikh, and Narula, who we're really pleased to have here today to give a performative sorts lecture for about 40 minutes or so, and then we can have an open discussion about that. So thank you, Monica, for coming, and I shall simply invite you up to the semi-stage.
Thank you so much for the invitation to be here with everyone. Some conversations have been running for a little longer than others, but what I'm hoping to do is present, it's interesting, the idea of artistic research kind of in action, right, kind of like that. So some of the things that we've been working together in, or ideas that we've been thinking together in RUX, and it will be interesting to hear kind of engagements and conversations that emerge from that, arise outside of that, and we can see where that takes us. So, RUX is a multi-headed animal, and our obsession is time. In other words, you could say that we are kitted out ab initio to deal with a time that turns hungry, not just in one mouth and stomach, but ravenously, polycritically, in many heads, jaws, throats, in an intertwining of guts. I will speak to you tonight about twilight and about cavalcades, about threshold conditions that invite us to cross over into perilous and pleasurable uncertainties, where time, space, our bodies, everything becomes crack and gate and channel of the electrical currents of our world and of this moment. One could say that to accommodate ourselves in this incandescent time, we become a house of everything and nothing. That is why we had to invent a word to describe the contemporary condition, or the feeling you have when you have more than one, when you have more than one headache at the same time. So this was kind of it, and the reason is that it was inspired by this character in the Ramayana who is called Ravan, and he's a 10-headed god or demon, depends upon your perspective, like in all things, and whose 10 heads we have seen going up in flames, all his heads exploding once a year ever since we were children. It signifies a change of seasons because it happens every fall. It signifies a time of change. So what does it feel like to have 10 heads, or even facets of ideas in those 10 heads that don't necessarily agree with one another, but are still too hungry for one belly or argument to deal with? The play was ravenous or ravenous, polyhedral. And so I'm standing here, one head of three, or sitting here, doing the work of the three heads of rocks as one, trying to address this question that has been posed and already started conversation of, which is the term polycrisis. And it is a term like Ravan's heads, which explodes. So I'm just going to give a little brief survey of how it can get read, and that was kind of productive for me too when I was thinking about it. First entering the planetary consciousness at the United Nations Climate Change Conference, COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh in November 22. And the writer Jonathan Derbyshire chose it for his 2022 year in a word piece in the Financial Times, defining polycrisis, and this I thought was interesting, as a collective term for interlocking and simultaneous crises. So the word collective got played in a different way. And again in October 22, the British economic historian Adam Tooze launched his monthly column in the FT again, I believe, with the heading, "Welcome to the World of Polycrisis." A problem becomes a crisis when it challenges our ability to cope, and thus threatens our identity. In the polycrisis, the shocks are disparate, but they interact so that the whole is even more overwhelming than the sum of the parts. And at times it can feel as if one is losing one's sense of reality. In 2023, the World Economic Forum embraced the term in its Global Risks report, stating, "Concurrent shocks, deeply interconnected risks, and eroding resilience are giving rise to the risk of polycrises." So the report explores the interrelation of geopolitical, environmental, and socio-political risks. So it's a term that comes with all the heft and weight of the financial people, besides all the feeling and guts and visceral understanding that we all know what we feel when we actually hear the word. But perhaps the word has even an older vintage. In the 1999 book, Homeland Earth Manifesto for the New Millennium, complexity theorists Morin and Kern had said, one is at a loss to single out a number one problem to which all others would be subordinated. There is no single vital problem, but many vital problems. And it is this complex inter-solidarity of problems and antagonisms, crises, uncontrolled processes, and the general crisis of the planet that constitutes the number one problem. So it's the kind of bringing together of all problems that we know are equally vital. The inter-solidarity of problems, as a way of characterizing the distinction of a polycrisis, is an interesting twist on the term solidarity. It suggests we need to enter into the shadows of language itself, to turn words inside out, and to cajole them into parenthetical dances, to make them do the work that they may not be accustomed to doing. Untangling an intersolidarity of problems will require us to embrace an intersolidarity of embodiments that can face these entanglements. Sometimes to undo one knot, you have to make another. When Kabir, the mystic poet from 15th century India, speaks of pregnant bulls and barren cows, he inverts the directions of potency and fertility. And then he speaks of frogs that keep snakes as watchdogs, and then he's challenging our notions of security and danger and fear. So following on from this mystic poet of another time, if we were to accept the protocols and codes of twilight language, we could rewrite the grammar of the contemporaneous along the protocols of what we are calling knots and cavalcades of being. We think that the predicament of a polycrisis demands a response with a fresh account of movement forms. Like the polycrisis, we need to foreground an imagination of movement that is not reducible to one thing, but proposes an untamable composite, differentiated and yet at the same time multiplied, a morphology of figures. Perhaps more appropriately, instantiation, incarnation, inhabitation of forms and figures from within and without histories and ghosts of histories. We are calling this movement gathering a cavalcade, a processual, processional constellation of figures, not affirmatory of any goal or maneuver or a military putsch, but in the play as a play. How might we begin talking of, but also acting out this dynamic that we are calling the cavalcade? First, we'll identify some moving parts and see what they are doing and how they signal. For example, a tongue attempting to form language anew and measuring the unspoken with the untested on the ground of the untasted, perhaps. A face of a guardian spirit appearing in dreams. We are mesmerized and riddled by how the terrain in the dream folds the antecedent, the precedent, the elapsed, the extinct, the moment today and the moment approaching. Perhaps a constellation of shadows in an ashen landscape, lining up to form a chaotic assembly, as if emerging from a dusk storm, or a blizzard, or static, or a volcanic eruption. A gathering, a procession, a horde of ways of being. In the notes that we have begun to write about the cavalcade, we write, there are ghosts and hybrids and mutants that span the humanoid machine spectrum, and a vision of cohabitation, caution, and the co-presence of different planets and registers of time. This walking, thinking, talking, dreaming cavalcade has the feel of a radical rapture, but also rupture. It has a granular texture of the realities and dreams of our time. Some forms might seem to recall extinct life. But what if the things we call extinct are perhaps just invisible or in hiding? They may have chosen to conceal themselves in plain sight, or might have withdrawn from the gaze of scrutiny. They are fading and forming, and fading and forming. Three-legged time comes calling to project its unfiltered, muttering thought stream. With this triped or tripod comes an entourage, attendants, accomplices. This is the cavalcade. It may recall the hurrah and the harumph of the wild mountain god Shiva's bacchanalial wedding procession. That procession, very well known to many people in the subcontinent, was a procession of the riffraff, of outsiders, of crematorium dwellers, of bulls, of other animals, of ghouls and drunkards, of the not normal. In such a moment, the given breaks down and makes room for the extraordinary and the ordinarily miraculous, so that all manner of things known and unknown can leak into the structure of our everyday consciousness. This is a lot like the way in which things appear and disappear at the edges of visibility and legibility in the city of Delhi when the winter smog sets in. Each year around the middle of November, a series of factors such as automobile emissions, garbage incinerators, farmers burning crop residue, a sudden burst of fissile gunpowder in the air as a result of fireworks detonated during the celebration of the festive night of Diwali, as well as atmospheric pressure, temperature, wind condition, all of these create a respiratory polycrisis that also gives us an image and metaphor for a twilight that extends over our city. Thinking in this haze is an interesting process. Working through this haze guides both intuition and knowledge. The haze is one of affection, it envelops us after all, but also of threat. It is stochastic and persistent. To live and think these zones, we cannot separate the informant and the informed. It is from here that another vision of the world emerges. That vision is both dispositional and philosophical, self-serving and dependent, collapsing and expansive. The insistence on pure self-reliance fails. Here, as the forms that we're thinking are sort of responding to the complexity of the ideas of being themselves. So this is where, and reaching a point where I was saying that we could say that this location, this intersection, or this kind of crux of things is where perhaps ambiguity thrives or needs to thrive, because it also allows us, so we could say that this is where ambiguity thrives. It allows us access to those parts of ourselves that would normally lie outside a normal interlocutory range. It makes it possible for us to be infrahuman and extrahuman and responsive to frequencies that lie outside the auditory and cognitive spectrum of the here and the now. In this way, the circumference of the kind of knowledge that gets produced collectively expands. This speaks to the language of reason, but it also accesses what can be said or hinted at in the glossolalia of the fabulous. We are knotted, we are knotted, and become undone at the same time. The historian Adam Tooze, whom I mentioned earlier, spoke of the overlap of the COVID-19 pandemic, rising awareness of extreme weather events as indicators of climate change, and a sudden spurt of armed conflicts in different parts of the world as semaphores of the Polycrisis. But one could say that we've actually been here before. In our research into medical records of Indian soldiers who fought in the First World War, and there were I think there were about 2 million people that went from India in the First World War. We found similar intersections between the battlefields of the First World War, social conflict, forced migrations, and the debilitating toll of the Spanish flu pandemic. Report take 1. Indian Base Post Office, 23rd January 1915. Sir, this report is in continuation of that numbered 161-3A related to the week which ends today. The Indian mail of the 26th of December was received here on the evening of the 16th of January and was dealt with on the 2 following days. It contained nothing worthy of remark. Nothing of any importance has been received from the French Post Office during the week. The mail to India, which was at first regarded as negligible, has now become the most important part of our work. A number of letters from men with their units at the front have been examined. They betray undeniable evidence of depression, but the feeling is not universal. The letters examined contained nothing contrary to regulations. It is the letters from the Indian wounded which are the difficulty at present. Attention was first drawn to these in my report of the 4th instant. Indeed, it was on the strength of that report that the supervision of this correspondence as a means of ascertaining Indian feeling was formally enjoined upon this office. Since then, this subject has been mentioned in each report. The tendency during the month has been for these letters to increase largely in numbers and in length. At the same time, there has been a marked change in tone. Grumbling is still almost entirely absent, and there is never any hint of resentment or anti-British feeling. Quite a number of letters are still marked by the most admirable spirit and the most appreciative references to the excellence of the arrangements in the English capitals, and these are still very common. But adverse signs are growing more conspicuous. Many of the men show a tendency to break into poetry, which I am inclined to regard as a rather ominous sign of mental disquietude. The number of letters written by men who have obviously given way to despair has also increased. emerges in the wake of chaos and panic, or the forced quietude of a quarantine, can be read, as these reports said, an excess of poetry. Sometimes it is a conversation in images, missives to self and the world, indexing mood swings in lockdowns and a share in the planet's lucid dreams. If we could say this in one sentence, we would say it made the congealed stability of the world turn into a kind of flux, and underline the precariousness and our sense of the fragility of the present time. Our condition is in fact a threshold between human, animal, vegetal, and mechanic forms of occupying consciousness, of inhabiting space and time. This awareness does not have to be shadowed by an anxiety or crisis of sentience. In other words, it need not be underwritten by a nervousness about whether or not our species' self-awareness is now rivaled by the sentient co-presence with us or within us of other life forms. They could be animal or vegetal or machinic. Even plant forms compel us to acknowledge their presence now, their nervous intelligence, their affect. A walk in a garden or in a forest is undertaken knowing that the vegetal is a certain form of what we are beginning to call consciousness. And we all know that playing with your cat we cannot play with our cat without knowing that the cat is also playing with us. With the machinic, however, the conversation usually yields to an anxiety about a takeover of the field of consciousness by AI. The anxiety arises because we cannot reconcile what we know to be the inanimate or insensate nature of these entities with the uncanny sensation that we process when we see them doing things as if they were alive or sentient or conscious. I don't know how many of you have seen this little video, but it was all the rage on the internet because one robot kidnapped a dozen other robots. And it's a very interesting conversation if you were to go looking for it, because the language that, it's of course in a manner programmed that this was given a certain set of instructions to go and engage. But what's very interesting is it uses the language of work and of home and come with me and then to go and the rest follow. So this was utterly unplanned and unprogrammed. So this is this moment when the language and it's interesting, of course, because the word robot, as we know, comes from the working body. So the robot is the worker. And it's interesting because the mini robot actually asks these other robots, are you tired? Do you want to go home? And then they follow. And it's all available online. So we were intrigued by this, and we've also seen that there have been very interesting moments like this. There was another report some years ago of a robot in a mall that committed suicide by literally pushing itself into a fountain. So it's very interesting what happens and why it happens and the glitches, and I think that this is something we think a lot about, of course, also is the idea of the glitch and what the glitch permits or what it confronts us with. But here I'm just going to talk about a different perspective, which is an object possibly alive because of the congealed labor permeated in it? So this is an interesting twist on the idea of congealed labor as dead labor, and we're just playing with that idea. Can one think of congealed labor as a different kind of livingness? We were asking ourselves, what is agency? To us, it is the search for livingness in living labor, right? Usually the worker's experience and biography are narrated within the logic of exhaustion. The worker is very tired, is being extracted and is exhausted from the exploitation that the worker is suffering, fatigue as a result of that. However, when liveliness is claimed by the figure, then agency is understood and made possible. I'm reminded here of the visionary and witness, the proletarian visionary and witness called Louis Gabriel Goni, whom Jacques Rancière invokes in Knights of Labor. and who is presented to us as someone deeply engaged in taking back the night. That's what the book, his story is a lot about that. A joiner by trade, Ghani is reluctant to accept the view of the worker as a figure restricted to his social situation. Campaigning against, and this is like late 18th century, early 19th century France, campaigning against what he presents as the experience of servitude fundamental to labor in the France of his day, Ghani lays claim to philosophy and culture. He writes of taking the time not according to him in order to pursue the emancipation that derives from the time to think. There is a line in which he says, I no longer have faith in time. He writes that in his notebook, and is a sign that even in a category as basic as time, a category as basic as time is subject to a worker agent scrutiny. And in an essay we wrote some years ago called X Notes and Practice, we wrote this in 2004, we spoke of certain kind of illogical figurations of that time. And these 5 figures that we wrote about in that 2004 essay, one was illegal aliens on a boat navigating the Mediterranean Sea, squatters building a roof for their homes with tarpaulins in shelters in Delhi, electronic pirates burning a CD in Shanghai, hacker networks dispersed across time zones liberating software, and workers protecting machines in an occupied textile factory in Buenos Aires. This is all happening in 2004, right? Oh, sorry, I have to go back. So one can reread these figures, which was what we were doing in the essay. One, the first as a cartographic pioneer, mislabeled the refugee, an urban design pioneer, defamed as a squatter, a technological innovator reduced to being known as a hacker or a pirate, a proletarian pioneer evacuating, even if temporarily, spaces of industrial production from the grip of relation otherwise known as capital. Because it was interesting, because the women workers especially had occupied this factory and had protected the machines from being destroyed by the owners, and demanding that they were the one, because they cared for the machines, and that they wanted to continue to work with them. Each of these figures were later forced back into narrative figuration, right? Flattened, and they were ironed into history. They stopped being the bumps in the landscape that they had begun by being. Retrieving and recovering these instances of agency can be an artistic act that can denaturalize the governing fictions of power. How can this form of embodied agency affect the everyday? Simone Weil reminds us that a test for what is real has often to do with the fact that it is experienced as hard and rough. Joy may be found in it, but not pleasure. That which is pleasant, according to her, belongs to dreams. The reality of the Polycrisis is cantilevered on a complication of the idea of agency. There is more roughness available than joy, and yet how we narrate our realities may sieve reality from the meshwork of dreams. Can we make a transition to telling ourselves a different story of stories? Some years ago in Athens, we found citizens who had found creative ways, who were weaving and darning the commons of their city in the aftermath of the Greek economic crisis, a living polycrisis if ever there was one. And they formed self-help groups, they formed clinics and schools and gardens. It was the density of the city, which otherwise often seen as the source of many of its problems, that turned out as the source of the density of connections that turned out to be the saving grace of how people survived in Athens. It was, so in a sense, its internal matrix helped the city survive. And the same thing happened in Delhi when COVID happened. I mean, the only way that, including one of us in Rux, survived is because someone had finished using a breathing apparatus, and then it was all happening on social media, it was all happening on, and nothing to do with the government or the state or anything like that. You just found out from someone who found out from someone, and it was the matrix of connections, the network of the city itself, of strangers, that helped people breathe when they could not breathe at that time, such as an oxygen cylinder. We need not see these only as responses to the collapse of the economy and the state. We can also see them as anticipations of a future marked by the liveliness of the commons, right? And the idea of liveliness in any case as agency, as I was talking about earlier. Sorry. Yeah. But first, a tiny diversion into submarine archaeology. So these are cups that are replicas that we made of a cup that we found in the Athens Archaeological Museum. We came across a vitrine over there displaying a drinking cup for wine, we think, found in an ancient shipwreck off the island of Antikythera. This is a very famous shipwreck because the first computer, quote unquote, the Antikythera mechanism was also found in this shipwreck. It's a very hard shipwreck to get to, it's very, very deep. But a cup was found over there that looks like this. And it has the word Pamphilos etched on its rim. Now, Pamphilos, it can be translated, it can be a name of someone, so perhaps it belonged to someone. But it can also be translated as friend of all, Pamphilos. So this was a question that we were like, is it a name or is it a way of saying that passing a cup of wine between hands is a marker of the common bond of friendship? When we found Pamphilos in Athens, we also met archaeologists and deep-sea divers. We met scholars and poets and teachers and migrants and doctors and nurses and researchers and dramaturgs and lawyers and pharmacists. We met so many people all tending to the shipwreck of the everyday, of scavenging capitalism. We met them in free clinics, in hospitals, in volunteer-run language schools, in self-organized cafes, and in parking lots turned into parks. It was a lesson in diving into an ongoing, massive experiment with living that has occupied the time of our entire planet. This is Metis. She was the goddess of contingent knowledges, small knowledge. She was the daughter of the sea and a patron of the skill and knowledge of sailors, of how to survive. Being a sailor on a boat, you turn to Metis. She was swallowed, eaten up by a fearful Zeus. And she, sovereign knowledge, if you ever have it, swallowing small knowledge. She appeared in our conversations as a form of intelligence that confronts the permanence and universality of dominant sovereign power. And so in finding Metis, we found actually only a drawing of Metis, and we translated that into a three-dimensional sculpture. We also found the sensibility of the practical wisdom of Pamphilos, of collectivity. Congealed labor accumulates as dead labor, and its domination subdues living labor. But when we flip that over, we can surmise that our ghosts, have kept alive the liveliness of living labor. It gets exhausted and fades, but phantoms bring it back to life and to presence. And we are calling these kind of presences illogical figurations. These are entities that have no clean timeline, they have no clean story, they have no clean narrative. There is a sudden appearance usually. There is no clear phenomenological presence. And they often get narrated to us as figures of demons or ghosts or ancestry or basically characters of the cavalcade that we are thinking about. In Athens, the work of repair and restoration was often done after hours, right? After your work hours were done. Doctors would go to their social clinics after a full day of working, then they would go and work for free in social clinics. A kind of twilight work. A kind of work done not in the time allotted to you, but in recuperating time for yourself like Goni was doing. Taking back the night, taking back his own self, through re-narrating the day and the night in a different way, not just as reconfiguring the body for labor, demanded labor as a worker in the following day. a kind of twilight work, a deep dive in search of a submarine horizon to rediscover the things that we take for granted, like breathing or like breathing together. Here, twilight is a state of in-betweenness, of submergence, a state of the refusal of the acceptance of the division of life between above and below, or work and recuperation, between thought and dream, or image and whimsy, a refusal of the division of time and space. And in this state, human beings speak differently. When they speak with love and joy and play, in the state of play there registers a fantasy and wickedness and an openness towards inhabiting futures where the material world and nature and cosmos are all folded within each other, and where animals, machines, and humans recover grounds of equality and conversation, where a conversation happens within this time but not bounded by this time, when there is one leg always outside the polycrisis. There's a word that we use a lot in our work, we call these figures Betal. A Betal is traditionally a shape-shifting goblin, an apparition which is popular in many of the stories that we grew up with. But actually, if you translate the word, it also just means off time. So not in rhythm, not keeping time is your time. So it was just an interesting formulation for us with the language. The word itself permitted us to think about figures, because even in the stories, a Betal poses riddles and disrupts common sense by throwing counterintuitive questions that are contrapuntal to the flow of ordinary time. Only a machine or an animal that is lurking within our own awareness of ourselves can ask us, how human are we? How much of us is and was and will be human? We cannot necessarily ask us that question if we are assuming our humanity. We think it remains alive in a present tomorrow sense as a question. It is both of this time and also not of this time. It is given birth by this time, and yet it stands outside this time. The gift of tomorrow received today, and vice versa. This is the question that the Betal of the Polycrisis is throwing at us. Our attempts at conjuring answers from the substance of our time or out of thin air are sparks and glows and forms, and they're all from the autoluminous. We need them as much as we can find. Thank you.
Okay, let's start.
How to switch this on, actually. Hello, it is on. Many thanks, Monica. Many thanks for this wonderful lecture. You told me before it will be hard to respond to, and I kind of knew before. So I thought, well, what is the best way to respond? And I thought, well, I cannot compete with the beauty and depth and complexity of your presentation, of your lecture performance, or multimedia lecture, we could say. So I will do something very dry to use it next to it. Something by also linking your presentation in a very direct manner to the topic of science, scientific research, and the question whether something such as twilight can be found in very classic philosophy of science. So I deliberately also chose classic theory of science I will refer to in a minute, not the feminist approaches we all grew so fond of more recently, and decided to look for something related, and then we can discuss whether it is related or not. So the term polycrisis, the title of our panel, signals that the situation is complex, incalculable. So it's kind of an alarm signal. And because the situation is experienced as out of control, whenever one hears this term, as if ever anything would be under control, but because this experience is so strong that something is out of control, one observed consequence of the experience of polycrisis is a tendency towards polarization, towards conflicts between two or sometimes more, maybe even 10, radically opposing interpretations. So these are situations of confrontations between two stabilized opposing groups and beliefs, both parties devoting considerably energy into stabilizing and defending their own viewpoint and view. What we can sometimes observe in these situations when parties can't even speak anymore with each other because there's no common ground, find as pseudoscience. And for him, pseudoscience is exactly these practices that lack the diligence and carefulness and thoroughness of scientific research. So pseudoscientists then, in contrast to scientists, foster a naive realism which imitates the trivialized form of the epistemology of the sciences, yet it does not imitate the actual research practice, the laborious practice in the lab, so to say, or somewhere in the field. So the pseudoscientist fosters an ideology of immediate evidence, of factual proof. In that sense, it is pseudoscience which uses the rhetoric of the factual, definite, unambiguous, presented then as something seemingly obvious, factual, illuminated from all sides, so no doubt, no shadows, nothing hidden, all clear. And this is precisely where Rox and your idea of the twilight language becomes so appealing and interesting and important. So of course, some of the qualities of twilight are that something appears, yet is not fully illuminated. It changes appearance, as you have shown so beautifully. Something, or some aspects might hide in the shadows. Something appears, but cannot be clearly localized. Something is there, but what of it is imagination? What of it is a projection of my wishes, my fears? What do others see? What do others see that I do not see? So, as I said, as a way to respond to your proposal, I looked for terms and descriptions that are related to the notion of twilight or threshold. You also used that term in the history of science. So what are related terms that philosophers of science use? What can we learn maybe from the theory of history and theory, very classic history and theory of epistemology about twilight. So if you look at Thomas Kuhn, who in the 1960s coined the term paradigm shift, which the title of our symposium these 2 days refers, he does describe the paradigm shift in perceptual terms, yet it is not twilight. It's more perceptual switch that is described in his writing. So he describes the process of a community switching between two paradigms, from one to the next. Constanze referred to this passage before. So Kuhn is describing the moment in which one group of scientists that so far has built their work on one paradigm switches over, or work within one paradigm, switches over to the differing paradigm of another group. And I quote from him in English: "Practicing in different worlds, two groups of scientists see different things, when they look from the same point in the same direction. Again, that is not to say that they can see anything they please. Both are looking at the world, and what they look at has not changed. But in some areas, they see different things, and they see them in different relations to each other. That is why a law cannot even be demonstrated to one group of scientists, but it may occasionally seem intuitively obvious to another. Equally, it is why before they can hope to communicate fully, one group or the other must experience a conversion that we have been calling a paradigm shift. The transition between competing paradigms cannot be made but at a step at a time, forced by logic and neutral experience. Like a gestalt switch, it must occur all at once, or not at all. So it's this optical metaphor he's using here from psychology of perception, the gestalt switch. This process of a shift, a switch, might end a moment of confrontation between different paradigms. It can only arise from a process, though, in which groups of researchers engage over time in depth with the scientific problem, reaching a moment in which they are letting themselves to be convinced or to give up previous knowledge and perceptions for new knowledges and perceptions. So here again, there's a perceptual switch, but no twilight. But what else do we find with Kuhn in Kuhn's text? Similar to Ludwig Fleck, Kuhn understands normal science as a practice which is cumulative and kumulatives Unterfangen. And normal science does not aim at new theories or new facts or new observations. It also doesn't find any if it is successful. But next, or embedded within these established practices, there is, and I quote again Kuhn, a prenumbral area occupied by achievements whose status is still in doubt. And here it is, the half-shadow, twilight, that which is not yet fully established, still in doubt. So let's search further just for a second and go back to Ludwig Fleck, who wrote his Genesis and Development of Scientific Fact in 1935. Fleck used the example of August von Wassermann's research on syphilis to describe the strange liminal space in which something truly new is being observed at an early stage of that research, of course. And again, I quote now Fleck: "It is therefore clear that the indications of the experiments were not well defined, the results of some were ambiguous. It is also clear that from these confused notes, Wassermann heard the tune that hummed in his mind, but was not audible to those not involved. He and his co-workers listened and tuned their sets until these became selective. The melody could then be heard even by unbiased persons who were not involved. It is not appropriate to speak of either correctness or incorrectness in these first experiments because something very correct developed directly from them, although the experiments themselves could not be called correct. If a research experiment were well defined, it would be altogether unnecessary to perform it. For the experimental arrangement to be well defined, the outcome must be known in advance. The more unknown there are, the newer a field of research is, the less well defined are the experiments. So we could rephrase and say the sciences operate in twilight, in spaces of uncertainty, of ambiguity, whenever they're actually aimed at bringing about, making appear something new, not yet known." We can add to this maybe a quote from Hans-Jörg Reinberger, which elaborates this further, and this is my translation from German. He says, "The aesthetic moment here lies," so in the empirical setup of an experiment in a laboratory, say in microbiology, the aesthetic moment here lies in the combination of intricacy and manageability of a system that is limited but remains complex, is still multi-layered, in which surprises are possible. The system is not perceived as beautiful because it is simple and elegant. It is perceived as static rather because it moves on a boundary or on a threshold. It has a structure that can be repeated and does not dissolve, and at the same time it contains something unresolved. So, if I'm trying now to develop some questions to you, Monica, from this little summary of some readings and philosophy and history and philosophy of science, one very general question would be whether these carefully constructed situations could catch something of what we don't fully know yet, what it is, relate in some way to your conception of twilight and twilight language, or to your methods of working, or maybe to also relate it back to this moment of confrontation. If we think about the Polycrisis as a perception of a diffuse confusion, endless uncertainty associated with this notion of polycrisis, this often triggers a longing for a reduction of complexity, for containment, for control. So very clearly Ruck's practice is opposed to this. There's something very different in your research, in your practice. You draw on diverse sciences, philosophical schools of thought, various media, to reflect on past ruptures and superimpositions and history and also futures. So speaking about your practice and about your methods of working with the materials of your research, with text, with language, images, sound, can you detect or specify in your work methods that specifically run against the tendency to simplify, reduce, and to pin down? Very much seems like. And maybe then would you be able also to comment on how you navigate between unintelligible, unresolvable maybe complexity and oversimplifications, how to navigate between these two poles, how do you work towards bringing diverse perspectives, narrations, views together, and nevertheless aim at taking your audience along. So one is about way of working, the other more about the term of twilight.
I mean, once she's asked that, there's nothing really left. That's a huge question, and I think this is it's like if one removes the word drugs from it, that remains the question, isn't it? Like, how does one engage with the fact that the more we don't know, or the more things seem impossible, and the more certitude becomes difficult in response to that, but also can you then bring certitude at all into play to react to something which is shaking the ground from underneath you? I mean, this is an interesting dilemma, and I think when we were, many years ago, we were asked to write a manifesto, and we said, we don't believe in manifestos, so we wrote a latento, which is just a kind of play on the fact that instead of making manifest what we want, we are just talking about what runs underneath and is latent to the things that, so we wrote a latento. It was a playful idea, but I think it becomes interesting if one thinks of the fact that when you say that I want to, for example, as if you want to do something together, it's not that you want to do something together. It's because you are together that something comes out of that. And that has been very much a part of our method in a way of being a collective as much, because it's not by saying, it's not that I want something to emerge. I know that if we are together, something interesting will emerge from that, and that we don't know what that thing is. I do not already know what I want to do. I just know that if we do things together, something will emerge that I know is going to be interesting but I don't know it yet. So it is this kind of tension between not knowing, and another thing we kind of also talk about is the fact that methodology itself is a very creative act. So it's not a question of it's not like saying, oh, this is the management part or something, or the administration part or something. And I think one can say this in a profound sort of way, looking especially at the way we're sitting in a museum. it's that when you start asking, if I approach something which seems infrastructural creatively, what will emerge will be interesting and creative again. So I think it's the same question. By acknowledging that you don't know is a fact. We hope we know, so we pretend we know. And I think it's very interesting that even a good experiment, even if you set up the terms, a good experiment, you do not know the answer to that, right? Like that is, if you already know what the answer is going to be, then it's not really an experiment. And so I think it's the same question, kind of the same, it's about the process. And I think this is why a lot of the kind of things that one was offering sort of deviates into the phantasmic or the phantasmagoric, but I mean, when reality itself seems impossible, then the only response is to say how ridiculous can I get in response to that, because when it comes to me, it's reached levels of ridiculousness that are you can't act with them in any. So a gesture, an artistic research gesture, I think is often about postulating back to the world the terms that it is offering you and saying, let's use that in a way that makes things possible rather than terrifying you into, I don't know, I guess I'm saying things that we all have said it in different ways, but I'm telling you how we are talking about it.
Also, it reminds me a little bit, because doing the tour of the Fellow Traveller show before, in a way, is somehow, I think, speaks in the same twilight in some ways. It was, in a way, it was a show that was designed without any concise thesis. In a way, it's deliberately so. And we had this term, serendipity, that we kind of had, like serendipitous programming, that we don't know yet what will happen with what happens here. And it was quite interesting that we then found out that there isn't a word in the German language for serendipity.
No.
Yeah. So then it became a bit of a joke to the point where our designers labelled the new font serendipity, ZKM serendipity. But I think it's in a way, it is changing the conditions in which we formulate responses. It's really key, if we're thinking about what artistic research is for this symposium, is how we first of all establish those frameworks. And I think that sense of not accepting that we don't know yet as a scientific tool might be something that could actually be quite interesting to reflect back upon scientific research itself. So I quite like the idea of maybe encouraging scientists to do twilight.
But they do.
Twilight, yeah.
This is what they.
But treasuring that as well. And it also reminded me of this recent story about the German mathematician called Alexander Grothendieck, who was ostracized by the mathematics community because he was in category theory and it was also completely abstract. He was going beyond. And he says all mathematicians they all work in the same house, and I want to build a different house in order to operate in. And in the end, his books became close to mysticism and spiritualism, and he was really talking about a design of the universe and so on. And he was disregarded, but then recently his ideas have been picked up again by even like Hawaii, the Japanese communications company, set up a research institute in Paris to study his texts as a way to unlock AI, like the next generation of AI. So there's always this, even in those kind of scientific twilight spaces, there's also these possibilities that somehow I think we as artistic researchers, we need to join with that as well. Simon, do you have anything?
Yeah, I have some responses that maybe can also form the basis of a discussion, rather than just questions for you, Monica. Although I would say, to begin with, one question that of course springs to mind is, following up on what Alistair said, how can we envision the methods of something like Rex Media Collective and probably a lot of the other artistic and practice-based research methods, and not just methods, but I would say practices that we're going to be presented with today and tomorrow. What could they contribute to a discussion on what constitutes research and knowledge in the field of science and in the field of academia in general? So rather than it being about our particular niche, what is actually a kind of more offensive way of thinking about these methodologies, particularly in light of the uncertainties of goalposts and evaluations and methodologies and ways of acting in general in a situation of polycrisis. So that's a long-winded way of bringing that question to the table. Secondly, if we are in a situation of the paradigm shifting and the ground literally shifting on us as we try to analyze and as we try to propose, etc., how do we distinguish between action and reaction in our work? I think that's a question for everybody. When are we acting and when are we simply reacting? This is something that I'm entirely unsure about. But I wanted to start with something else, which is kind of what you started with, the many-headed beast, which was interesting because it's kind of the opposite of the robot, because if I understood your robot metaphor, it's actually one head and many bodies, maybe, with AI, but it struck me that that's exactly what we're doing here. That's the only way it seems to me that we're constructing some sort of methodology, is by having all these heads, and maybe the program, the postgraduate program, and maybe these institutions are the bodies, I don't know, but there's all these heads, and each of them has at least one headache. Yeah. And sometimes maybe we have more than one headache, not just a headache in each head, but many headaches in the same head. And they probably have to do with these polycrises. So I think that's kind of what will come up. To me, that's the perfect image. I wouldn't call it a metaphor. Image of what we're actually trying to do with this particular symposium is to bring all these headaches to the table. And believe me, we have a lot of them. And then, of course, we can discuss, what causes these headaches, right? They can be from overthinking things. They can be from drinking too much. They can be from pollution. They can be from various chemical dispositions, etc. So that the notion of headaches and not staying with the trouble but staying with the headache might be very, very useful for what we're going to do, not just today and tomorrow, but really going forward. So that's what I was thinking about. Then, of course, in the notion of polycrises, we can sort of list them, and I thought they're interesting to just spend a little bit of time on identifying, and we did that a little bit in the write-up. So just to say, this idea was also comes in what crisis means. So the moment of crisis is, of course, a moment of uncertainty and instability, but it's also the moment of decision in Greek. So it's also that decisions need to be made because concerns are pressing and catastrophe is imminent, etc. Thinking of this as was Gramsci was mentioned in the beginning, the late Polish sociologist Zygmunt Bauman talked about, in one of his last essays, which is about 10 years old now, he talked about using the term of the interregnum, but he said there are basically three concerns that will decide the outcome of this interregnum, which is the period where the old order is dying and the new cannot yet be born, which is a Gramsci quote. And he talked about, of course, the future of the migrants. So he was also writing about, of course, the migrants of the Mediterranean. But this is, of course, in a general sense, what is the kind of the destiny and the fate of the issue of migration on a global scale. And then he talked of the environment, obviously, again, self-explanatory, I think, to talk about environmental crisis. And lastly, he talked about institutional disparity, which I find to be the most interesting term in his text on the interregnum, because it means that we don't have equal access to institutions and institutional life, and we often feel that the institutions are mismatched to dealing with the headaches that we have, be they in terms of the future of the migrants or environmental questions. So we feel that the institutions are perhaps crumbling, perhaps inadequate, perhaps too old-fashioned, perhaps they're too powerful, perhaps they're too weak, and we don't know often how to access them, or we feel some people have a lot of access to them, the rest of us very little. So this kind of disparities, both in terms of the institution's historical role in dealing with contemporary problems, but also how we as social groups feel an inadequacy in relation to institutions. And I think that's an interesting question to the museum, actually, to bring into question. We broadened it a little bit, and I was thinking about the list. So we, of course, say that Polycrisis is the crisis of the environment. So the pressing issues of ecology, and is ecological thinking the way to deal with this? Is it the slowness and stupidity of the COP meetings? Is it the faith in the Paris Accord, again, institutional disparity? Is it refusal of the whole idea? Is it to accept its inevitability and then think of ruination as the condition? The same goes for the question of infrastructure. So we had infrastructure crumbling while we were sitting here, which I thought was a moment of pure genius, even though it was not about the performance, but actually the cable simply didn't work in the center of media arts. Yeah. Says a lot about this kind of, which is something that, what was interesting about it is that it struck me that nobody was particularly surprised or embarrassed. It was just like, well, that's what it is. Yeah, these things don't work. Yeah, shit doesn't work. So we are used to crumbling infrastructure, right, as part of the crisis, and that leads then, I think, into some of the other issues, which is, of course, what we call in the right of political depression. I mean, you can describe that in many ways: the age of anger, the rise of affect, the disappointment, resentment, etc. Certainly not politics of joy, but all sorts of other effective forms of politics that seems to be totally engulfing the globe, the human population, but also this depression that we feel the inability to act. And we feel that we do not have painkillers that are strong enough to get rid of the headache, and if they do, they're temporary relief, because if I take 3 tonight, I know I'll have a headache again tomorrow, because again tomorrow the same problems will be there. So this leads to a certain sense of political depression. Then you could say, in relation to that, there's the social and economic factors, this idea of social inequality, the growing social inequality on a global scale, certainly also within Europe, where we are, in the heart of Europe. And then finally the last part, which is where we might spend some time, I think, which is the concept of knowledge. So what are the forms of knowledge that deal with all these headaches? That we are unsure about that. The concept of knowledge is in itself unstable and perhaps not so usable in terms of the tradition of Western science and rationality. On the one hand, we might want to introduce other ways of knowledge, but also if you have a theory of science, it tends to be because it has an object of study. But we don't know what our objects of study are. I don't know if we can define that here, what our objects of study. Is it art, culture? Is it something else? I don't know. But I would also say that more and more we don't have subjects of study in the sense of subjects that we produce, and any notion of a stable, whole, or definable sense of subjectivity that can do research. So that might also be on the question. So perhaps the very term knowledge is one that we need to leave behind. Think of the not knowing. Also, it's not really linguistically different, so different from knowledge, but perhaps we can propose to think of thinking rather than knowing, because knowing is helps us, but knowing also keeps us back, because, oh, I know that God only intended there to be man and woman, even though he didn't, he only created a man and a rib, but aside from that, right, so knowledge is also what constricts us. Like, it's not just what emancipates us, it's also what constricts us. So perhaps the very idea of knowledge in these kind of institutions needs to be at least bracketed in terms of thinking, which is not just recombination, but also has aspects of knowledge, but also aspects of speculation, and perhaps thinking less in terms of the truth regime of the thesis, which is the proven and the unproven, but more in terms of the proposition and the proposal, thinking if this is possible, then from that we can deduct so and so and so and so and so, as a way of thinking of so-called artistic research or practice-based research.
I was going to say, well, in a way, in terms of the institution, I think that kind of creates an issue, but an interesting issue. But there was a survey recently, I think actually here in Germany, where they asked who were the most trusted institutions, which institutions do people trust in, and it came out that museums were the most trusted institutions. Which is kind of a good thing, but then it puts a lot of pressure on museums at the same time. So if we are going to adopt these different methodologies, you would also then are in danger of eroding that trust in some kinds of ways, because I think people have an idea of their idea of a museum is quite fixed, and that's partly the reason why people have a sense of trust, because they're seen as unchangeable, like that unchangeability. So if we're talking about shifting paradigms, you're immediately into the realm of mistrust and not knowing and not being sure. So on the one hand, I think what we need to bear in mind is that yes, we can think in these ways. We can think about poetics and not knowing and not being sure. And it's actually more for me, it's a more accurate way to work in the world, a more precise way. But the public perception is one of being the opposite.
Well, I was wondering I think I'm going to disagree a little bit on that, in the sense that I was wondering why museums might be looked at as the institutions of trust. And I was wondering, and I'm not disagreeing, I'm just thinking aloud right now, is it because the museum does not, on the face of it, and this is of course fiction as much as anything else, but because it presents that which cannot be narrated singularly. Right, like a painting you can tell many stories about a painting or a film or whatever. So what you encounter in a museum cannot be immediately flattened into a single line. Like the expert is invisible, right? So the dead painter perhaps, or the living artist, it doesn't matter. But they are not necessarily, so the expert who is the curator or the director or the whatever, all the things that make up institutions become invisible, unlike say university, where or the corporation, where looking only at the example of what is happening in the United States yesterday and the murder of the head of the corporation, it is and legally the corporation seeks to be seen as an individual. It has rights. It becomes concretized as knowledge. And I think the museum remains a kind of a blurry space where, well, I don't know, maybe it's an exhibition that said something, but that's what the curator said, but I didn't like, I think the fact that people can feel more than one thing or think more than one thing perhaps is the best thing that one can take from the fact that the institution they trust is the one they can't narrate completely. And I think that's actually kind of a nice thought to me, keeping in mind what we've been talking about.
Yes, I think I agree, and it also has to do with how much credit one gives the audience, whether what you say, Monica, is you describe an audience that is also willing to do their own research, or their own thinking, their own interpretation, their will to not be presented with something very stable, with knowledge, as you use the term, as something stabilized, which is of course not knowledge production as a process, as these writers quoted were referring to. No, that research is something different than producing more than momentarily stabilized item of knowledge. So yeah, I think we should have more trust and faith in these processes of research and of the museum as offering these spaces. I'm more optimistic, I guess, than you, Simon.
Always. So I'll venture another slightly also possibly pessimistic analysis of the place of the museum. I wasn't aware that it was the most trusted institution in Germany, but I cannot help but think that it's also because what the museum is about is the past. And we cannot think of the future. When we do, we think of it mostly in dystopian terms. So is that why the museum is so trusted? Because of course it might be about the contemporary and preserving it for the future. It also has it's supposed to preserve also. But it doesn't present a vision of the future most of the time. It presents a vision of the past, which can of course be a critical one. It can be revisionist. It can also be conservative, etc. It can be many, many different things. So it's an interesting battleground, I would say, for narrative. But it tends to be narratives, in my view, about the past. And so how do we create narratives then about the moment of crisis, which is not the moment of the past, even though the past has led to these crises, but that will enable us then to go to the productive notion of crisis, which is the moment of decision. Can the museum do that? Museum director?
Yeah, of course. No, I can, but I agree with you. I think a part of when I was talking about people perceiving the museum as fixed is because they have this perception of the museum as preserving the past, in the public consciousness that's embedded, and that's something we need to change. You need to change the idea of the museum as being an active agent rather than being something that's just a sort of isolation chamber. That's the job they have to do, but it needs this artistic research and thinking, these processes we've talked about to unlock that. There was a nice show, by the way, just reminded me of that a few years ago in San Francisco called the Museum of Capitalism, where it presented a picture of the future. It was like in the future, after capitalism had died, it was a museum dedicated to looking back in history at this weird moment when capitalism existed. It was quite fun. The best bit was at the end the gift shop was completely empty and devoid of any products. But it's like playing the playfulness. That's also an important part in this, is a kind of, being okay to be playful as institutions and not being too uptight about what our scientific peers are going to judge us with, because in the end that also, that kind of generates a freedom of thinking and a connectivity between people that then becomes generative.
So maybe we open for...
Yeah, first I like this perspective away from knowledge to speculation, because I'm a little bit a fan of graphics from alchemy, and I found amazing your graphics about this dark matter research. Amazing, because I'm living now in Hamburg, and in Hamburg there's Daisy, and they're going to do this, and I had a lot of nice presentation from a physicist describing the dark matter research. And they don't, 70% of matter we don't know still today, 70%, amazing. So this is a nice hint to do different things and to do speculations. And or later you had this guy in this armchair and floating in with colors. I like this, floating with colors, with creativity. For example, in cinema, Dune is a good illusion. In Dune, the heroes take this strange poison from the snake and get hallucinations. I think that's a good hint to rediscover old, let's say, some shamanic traditions. In Europe there are also some, but I don't see many institutions who study shamanic traditions in Europe. It's not so frequent. So thanks for your presentation. It stimulated me a lot.
Anybody?
Yeah. Are there questions from the audience, from students, or comments?
Maybe something that... Okay, maybe something which comes up to my mind just by listening is maybe this separation of doing art or doing research, stuff like that. I by myself work a lot with in the field of computer science, but mostly with some artistic output, but still doing research about this, so writing papers and doing the math behind it and write the programs by myself and so on. And often the people come up with the question, is it useful? So why you're doing this? Can you do something which is useful? And this question for making it useful is not for the thing itself, it's always for something else. So like some goal, and it's a broader goal, maybe from a company, maybe from a society. And if we go more back to the past, then things are not as separated as they are today. So, and a lot of interesting inventions or ideas come up of a mixture of both. So.
Yeah, and there's a whole history there of the relationship between artists and computer scientists as well, which is in its way is an encapsulation of what you described, and that it at some point it was always the computer scientists in simple terms were kind of producing the data crunching machinery, and it was only when the artists or artistic sensibilities came into play that the field of computer science could be opened up into different avenues and different ways, which in a way is, I would argue, in a way is an indirect, there's direct and indirect use of misuse as well, is part of what I would call, rather than necessarily, we shouldn't get too stuck on this idea whether something is useful or not, but the idea of kind of usership, degrees of usership, and degrees of, so you're not, it's not a this or a that. And I think these kind of coefficients of possibilities are always kind of more interesting and a more accurate way to describe how the world works.
Yeah, I think with math is so.
By doing math, I think it's quite close to that. So if as more as you know and as more you expand the system, or as closer you look inside. So it's changing, and it's a construction which is somehow fit together, but it's also trying to do the things which are not possible, which come up or brings up new ideas.
Yeah, maybe I would love to bring it back to thank you so much for this, Monica and everybody. I would ask, maybe could you go back to the different types of agencies that are at play in the production of knowledge and in the production of knowledge for artistic research?
It's a really, I've already kind of speculated on the idea of agency, and I think it's something that, it's an interesting quantity for me, the word. I'm not always a fan of it. I think the idea of the agent implies a certain kind of individuation of the idea of subjectivity, and it kind of locates it. And always this sort of idea of the agent of change can come with its own kind of baggage, right? The word agent also makes it maybe kind of an idea of use, perhaps, like what use are you? What kind of agent are you? But it became an interesting idea if one was to and that's why it became like, how can one speculate on what again one knows? So if you assume that the idea of agent has certain kind of form, then let's take it far outside it so that even that becomes evacuated. There's a whole we wrote a whole essay on the fact that knowing that you don't know is a place of liberation, right? You know you don't know it. Once you know you don't know, then anything is possible. Not knowing that you don't know is actually the problematic position, because then you're kind of stuck thinking you need that second level of awareness, and a lot of the things that we do are interested in that as a kind of meta question. What is the second level of awareness that emerges when one is so? It became an interesting play to think about agency via machining, where it is it's fundamentally impossible in the terms that we live with right now. The machines do not have agency, right? They can't have agency because we are allotting activity, or what agent they are is a defined agentness given to them by the human. So to give agency where there cannot be is an interesting kind of push, because it asks you to think of the very idea of agency not as a use thing, but like what and again, I can only come from that place rather than talking about what actual agency could mean, because again, I know that I don't know, so I'm keeping it to that.
Well, maybe I can say something, because I want to pick up this example of these robots, because you now refer to the machine that cannot be an agent. And I was wondering, of course it's a beautiful find, there's like a video of this one robot then ending up to pull others along. We don't know a lot about the actual situation, whether it was staged or not, but I was, it stayed in my mind. I was wondering what it really meant for you. And is it about this problem of agency, why you used it, or can you comment more on
No, not really. I mean, I think I think when the contradictions that you know inherently become posed in a certain way, and I think that is also what the artistic gesture does, right? I briefly mentioned the idea of denaturalizing. I mean, that's an old artistic strategy. You denaturalize so that you can look at something which you know differently, scaled as that, materiality. I mean, these are tactics and strategies that artists use, and that is, and they do shift things. But when we were looking at this, so this little robot is called Airby. It has a name, and Airby is from one company, and the scenario was that the AI programmers of one company told the other one that there will be and so this is how it's also, it's a mise-en-scène, but it's not a script. It is a scenario in which things were permitted to happen and no one kind of knew what would happen. A lot like what we're talking about today. Like it is when you you can only set the platform, you can set a scenario and then you can wait. But if you do it in a way that is creative, unpredictable results will occur. And to me that was also an interesting part of this, is of course it's a contradiction. It is a contradiction that forces you to think about what are the terms you take for granted so that this contradiction either will stop looking like one or will push you into thinking about the deeper nature of what is happening over there. So it's kind of interesting. I mean, of course it's an extraordinary circumstance, but like one says, the ordinary miraculous is the extraordinary too. So it's just a play on, I mean, in my head at least, it permits me to ask of myself all my own starting points, I suppose.
This, because of the robots, immediately made me think of these 43 monkeys that escaped in North Carolina from this, what is it called, just a second, it's got this really weird name, from Alpha Genesis, so this sort of monkey breeding testing site. And then apparently, I don't really know the story. Like, these monkeys that escaped from this testing site, and then they broke out of their, I guess it's a monkey production space for different types of tests. But then the monkeys returned in order to liberate other monkeys that were still there. And somehow I find this really sort of interesting and a kind of signal that I think one monkey never returned. So I think they caught nearly all the monkeys, but I see this as a kind of parallel to the robots. And this kind of what are the accidental agencies that come out of these, the hypocritical conditions. And maybe this is what I mean, is what can we learn from that? Because these are sort of accidents where something happens and there is maybe some kind of agency at play that is unintended and could possibly be useful in terms of learning how to crack through different glitches in the system.
But shouldn't we be careful with the term agency then? No? because these are, of course, with robots, some kind of feedback things that happen, and then something happens. And I understand you more in the sense that collectivity, when your first answer to my question about methods, I found very convincing with this emphasis on collective ways of doing research that increase complexity, voices, and there, through this, make it more likely that something we don't yet know will appear, right? And this seems quite different from these things that might happen between motorized machines with sensors, I think. But it's a beautiful image, of course. There was a question, I think.
Yeah, not so much a question, but just a short comment I thought people might find interesting, since you brought up this study that Germans find museums to be particularly trustworthy institutions. And I looked this up briefly because I found it really interesting, and I thought it is worth noting that the study is authored by the Stiftung Preußischer Kulturbesitz, so by the Berlin State Museums. And if you look up other studies, they don't consider museums at all. So I mean, it is like the meme of Obama granting himself a medal, I guess.
Funny enough, it was someone from the Stiftung that told me that. But in a way, it's not unrelated. But I kind of think as well whether one of the crises we have or experiencing now is the fact that to do with this knowing and not knowing, knowledge and not knowledge, is that the more knowledge we generate, the more we don't know. The more we it's a bit like with the kind of dark matter. Just when we think Newton, just when we think Einstein, just when we think someone's cracked it and we know everything, that just opens the door to more. And it seems like amongst all the other polycrises, we've also reached this tipping point where we're still living in the shadow of this moment when we thought the world was going to be okay. Round about 2000 or so, we thought we were moving towards some kind of, there's a way to get an equilibrium, that we wouldn't have wars and all those kind of fantasies, and then everything comes crashing down again.
Can I ask this directly? What did you use? Because it was a series, this touched me deeply. It was a series, so many graphics for this and a nice variation. Remembering on Escher, challenging geometries and so a little bit illusionary things. I liked it so much, but what was the driving idea?
No, actually what we do, this is a practice, that all the images that you see are from different works that Rux have made. So each of this is a different artwork actually. So that was a series that kind of playing with, that was a series of drawings that were done just looking at what optical this thing, but I had spent some time. We had spent some time at CERN and spent a few days going into the because into CERN and walking around in the. They stop it after every 5 years. For 2 years, it's stopped, so you can actually go visit it inside. But for me, we talked with theoretical physicists, we spoke also with experimental physicists, but one of the highlights for me was the fact that there is something called the antimatter factory. And to me, it still makes no sense. It makes sense, but it does not make sense. What does it mean to have an antimatter factory? What does it mean to make that which does not? I don't know. It just remains one of those mysteries. And so it led to kind of the fact of using the optical play as just thinking about that which makes sense, but that it doesn't, which both makes and does not make sense at the same time. So it was just, but each of these is from a different work. The videos are from, so it's a kind of a cannibalization, if it were, as it were, of maybe 40 works in there, or different works from films and other such like things.
If I may, I just had one remark on, since we were speaking about images. Images in terms of emblems, in a way, models, metaphors. And there's something that just crossed my mind when I listened. That is, when you go back 500 years to the times of European Reformation, it is a time of deep crisis in theological and political and even military terms, evolution of absolutism. It is the time when printing press emerges in this very region, so the Rhine Valley, and in Basel, all the new printing presses, the new houses that produce book printing, they use the Hydra as their emblem. The big problem with the Hydra here is they say we use the Hydra, because if you cut off one head, you still have 9 new ones. So if the censors come and eradicate all the books, we still have copies, because we copy. So that's the freedom of the press, that's the new word. On the other hand, that is also the word of conflict. Because of that, you have censors. Because of the censors, you have prosecution and witch hunt. And also witchcraft and witch hunt is a topic of that time. And modern rationalization is also an effect of that. So crisis leads to this, you could call it an early form of dialectic of enlightenment. And we stayed with that for the last 500 years. So when we choose an emblem, it can be, it can be a sign of the time. But if it's, if it's Rax, it might have a completely different meaning than Hydra. Because, what the Europeans made with it was something different, I think. You know what I mean? It's like a symbol of the problem of rationalization. Like, can you tame the beast?
No, I mean, I use the word Hydra, but just to say that drawing was actually like an Iranian demon.
Exactly.
So there's kind of multiple, but I think maybe one just means, like Ravan is enough. To have multiple heads is a good start.
It also reminded me that, which is maybe relevant to the discussion as well, is we, in our imaginary, we tell ourselves that the printing press generates, suddenly enormous scientific knowledge in the world. That is the trigger board. But actually, for about 100 years, it was the popular fiction of the kind of anti-witch hunt literature that it really distributed. It took another kind of era to get over the scaremongering and the witch persecutions to actually get books to work in the way we think of them now. I can see a hand in the back.
Yeah, I wanted to ask, because we were talking about the images, and I was just in my class, which we talk about this as well. So I wanted to ask about the legacy media, legacy institutions, and as we're departing from the clear net structure and this idea of post-image, post-text, then what does it mean for knowledge transfer, and what does it mean for research, and what do you see or speculate in a sense where we're we had these clear net platforms, institutions became what they became, and then what does it mean for the image, what does it mean for the text? I know it's a very, you can talk about it for hours, but now that we're, because there was this idea of the text and the image, and
I mean, I would refer to the many-headed animal in this, however many heads it has. And I think that's possibly the answer, that we've had a phase of knowledge production which is centered around image and text, but also we have word, we have feeling, we have emotion. There are all kinds of different media and mediums through which we communicate and exchange knowledge. And I think what has to happen is, of course, images still have a place completely, and text still has a place completely, but all other forms also have a role in this. And it's almost, I was thinking of, this the 10-headed creature, but actually maybe it's 20, maybe it's 100, maybe it's infinite number of heads, and it's kind of like a sort of omnidirectional headache that we have at the moment. But I think that's in a way what cultural institutions certainly should be learning to embrace, and especially when we have robots leading each other astray. this is the field we're now operating in. So just to think about image and text alone, for me, is not enough.
But interestingly, these many heads have one body, and I don't know yet what to make of it, but I find it interesting.
I think this is the political structure that we're in. I think, here in this part of Europe, that we pretend we have one body, which is the European Union and a monetary fund, but each of these members have their own heads that are screaming and have terrible headaches, you know? And lots of them are bipolar and whatnot. So it's very difficult for this body to move, and at the same time, the body can see all these polycrises just like right, passing by. Right. So this is the situation that we're in actually. That all these headaches can't move this body in a progressive way. But maybe we don't need to think of progress. Maybe it's okay to stand still and run around and dance and take drugs.
Maybe this would be actually the same. I get a question that would be in the same direction. Like, okay, because Simon, you were talking about crisis is the time of decision making also, and then if we stay with the metaphor of the poly-headed hydra, and many heads are going in different directions, how can we do decision making in a time of polyphony, so to say? And my question would be, is it enough to just say, let's stay where we are, or maybe it can then be, if you talk about shifting paradigms, maybe the figure of the drifter, the drifting on the shifting tectonics paradigms whatsoever can be a metaphor or figure, but I think it cannot be enough for us to say the answer is we cannot do any decision making at all, because that's a bit like avoiding the conflict where we are in. Maybe just a comment.
Yeah, it's not that. I think that's exactly the problem with institutional disparity, because we have a political structure, not just in the European Union, but that it's unable to make decisions that should have been made yesterday. They're unable to make them tomorrow, right? So this is our problem. So it's not. So it's absolutely not enough. You know, I think of all people, Slavoj Žižek put this brilliantly in this book, Living in End Times, where he says this is around the financial crisis. He says, what happens when world leaders meet to discuss the environment? They agree we don't have to act now, let's wait till next year. What happens when the banks go bankrupt? They meet and say we fix this tomorrow. Right? So this is the part of the institutional disparity, which of course leads to all this affect and anger and depression, because we can all see that. But I don't know how, we as individuals or as social groups can change that. And that's probably the biggest crisis of all. This is where institutional disparity is I think such an important notion, because we can see that these decisions aren't being made, even though supposedly all the structures are there that should enable these decisions to be made, including all the knowledge from science, including that, which was our hallowed production of truth and knowledge and accumulation of capital for 500 years, was science. Now, when science contradicts the interests, short-term interests of capital, it's no longer needed. But it's not really supplanted by any other discourse or paradigm, as of yet, which is why I think the interregnum is for me, the most useful way of thinking about the times that we're in.
I think as we're at time now, I think that's a good note to end on. I think it tees up the next day of discussions as well. So,
I mean, for the moment, it is just to say thank you, Monika. Thank you all for the discussion and for bringing up so many questions and few thoughts and not so many answers, but that was also not the intention, I guess. And unfortunately, we have to leave this space now, because the museum is actually closing at 6, but the good message is the HFG is still open. And you are all invited to leave this space, to please also take your bags if you lock them inside of ZKM, because you will not get the chance to get it out today. If you don't do it now, you have to do it now, yeah. and come over to the HFG, and there we have the dinner intervention. So some drinks and food is waiting for you. From 6, so you have quite some time, like 10 minutes time to find a way over. And thank you again. And yeah, we are continuing tomorrow with 3 other panels, and we will then not start here, but start over there, also in the special architecture for the symposium, which you have the chance to inaugurate now, as I said before. But first of all, thank you all for this.